So we missed a very important thing on the agenda last week in the first episode of Expected by Whom. Very embarrassed for both of us because we had talked about this. And so, Prashanth, I think we owe it to ourselves right now to open this episode the proper way and a toast to the new show a week late. So, cheers to you. I've got what's your drink of choice for to celebrate week one in week two?
Well, so we always have to plug our Michigan whiskeys here, and so we've got our Traverse City whiskey, barrel proof. They're rye. This was a rye pick done by my club down here in Durham, North Carolina. Tremendous stuff. So if you guys get a chance to go up there, absolutely worthwhile. Everything from them is delicious.
I'm in Michigan, so I don't have to have the Michigan whiskey since we've already got that. I've got the I'm going with the Powers today. It's I'm pretty happy with that. And so, my friend, cheers to a new show.
Cheers. And with that being said, welcome to Expected by Whom, a podcast exploring the world of hockey through unique lenses, brought to you by the Wing Wheel Podcast. We know a lot of you tuning in are Red Wings fans, and the Wing Wheel Podcast is the biggest and best Detroit Red Wings show out there. Find the show wherever you listen to or watch your podcasts, and go to wingwheelpodcast.com for more.
Statistic, because, and now the new one is expected goals, expected saves. Those can be, to me, not just goaltender, but team defensive statistics as well. We need to be better. We need to improve in that. Can we do it? Are our best options within, including those two young guys, or is it looking at other options? Now, right now around the league, look around, like we're all looking, every team is looking to, whether it be to improve in one area, whether it be their starter or backup. With a lot of teams in the league right now, where, the goaltending market is somewhat thin. So, whether we go back with the same three, we need to be better. That goes for all three of them. But ultimately, as a team, we need to be better to help them out too. We can't, I think we did reduce the grade A chances we give up this year. We need to continue to bring that down, make it a little bit easier on them.
You mentioned expected goals there. How do you use things like that? How do you use the analytics like that for yourself as you make decisions for both long-term and short-term?
We look at everything. There's all sorts of statistics. Truthfully, I'm not sure what necessarily to read into them. I've found over the years we're still in the infant stages, I believe, in the NHL of what's important, what's not important, what really has bearing or not. And it takes years to decide if these things are really, really important. 10 years ago, everybody was focused on Corsi and Fenwick. Now it's different things. And in time, we'll look back and say, this is important, that's not important, or that's important. So, for myself, I guess to answer your question, I have my own, and we have internally what we think is really important to us and what we really value, and don't really care to elaborate on it just because, we'll do things our way.
Well, thank you to day one lifelong listener from Expected by Whom, Steve Yzerman, who I can only assume that conversation and that line of answering, bringing up expected goals and expected saves in a discussion with me during media exit interview over Zoom was because he listens to this show. Only being half serious.
Yeah, as
on
I'm
that.
Yeah, I mean, as I'm sitting and watching the presser and I hear him start dropping expected by and expected saves, I'm going, all right, just the next one coming around is going to be expected by whom, and I'm just waiting for him to plug that show for us. But you have to tip your cap. Steve is always looking for information. We're just going to assume he's a day one listener and run with it from there.
Yeah, I mean, and if Steve, I know you had a really good. You went on Alan Walsh's podcast during the year, so Steve, there's always an open invite. I'll extend it right now. Always an open invite to come on. The draft lottery is May 9th. It's the day after your birth. The draft lottery is May 8th. Your birthday's May 9th. If you'd like to come on and celebrate a draft lottery win on your birthday, come on the show. The invite's open, Steve. So let's. we're all you know where to find us. Text the PR guys. So,
and with that, I think his answers ultimately created or led to a couple of illuminating topics that I think are worthwhile for us to dive into. And I think probably one that sits on the minds of a lot of Red Wings fans over the years is, what can we glean from Yzerman's response in terms of how we think the Wings use analytics? He obviously talked about having a group of guys in his organization that works on the metrics or materials that they highly value. But, Sean, in your opinion, kind of being a little closer to the organization, do you have a sense, or how do you think the Wings incorporate analytics into their approach?
Yeah, I think kind of reading between the lines on Derek Lalonde in particular, and it's interesting. I have a better feel for the day-to-day because the players give us a little bit more of how Derek Lalonde and the coaching staff use it. I mean, they're big at looking at the expected goals does mean a lot to them, reading between the lines, looking at, and players have even kind of mentioned, they get kind of cagey when you bring it up because it's clearly kind of a taboo thing to talk about as a player still. But you get the feeling where they look at expected goals more. They look at high danger chances, and those things. And I'm actually curious. It's one of those things where I'm curious of how they look at high danger chances, because there's obviously different ways that different models or different ways different analysts can diagnose what a high danger chance is. So that's one of those kind of like black box things I'd love to like figure out someday. But I think from a day-to-day coaching staff, and we always hear Derek Lalonde would talk about his team, even when they were doing well, he would look at, we're not really doing that well analytically. Our underlying numbers don't look good. And those are the times where the Wings would often be overperforming their expected goals. They would be there. And then there was times where he would look at the team and he'd talk about, our numbers actually aren't that bad, and they'd be losing, and those would be times they'd be underperforming expected goals. So for me, I think that one is a big one that they use as a kind of a barometer from a day-to-day coaching staff standpoint. Now, there's a lot of other, I think dissecting how the Wings use it long-term, and let's kind of split this conversation properly, how they use it long-term is another thing. But I think day-to-day, short-term, Derek Lalonde kind of uses it as like a stabilizer to, did my team play well? Did my team not play well? It's another data point that I can use to work with what I've seen in front of me during that respective game.
Yeah, I mean, he's been very transparent over the course of the season in terms of giving exactly what you're talking about. Early in the year when the Wings were racking up some wins that maybe they shouldn't have had, he's sort of pointing that they got lucky, the goalie took over, Billy Hussos came up big, things along those lines. And he's been very, very open and honest about that. And I think there's a little bit of a history here of the Wings coaching staff, utilizing analytics a little bit more. Folks may remember under Jeff Blashill, he would often reference high danger chances a lot. He would talk a lot about, those grade A opportunities given up. And that was something you could tell that he focused on, from that short-term, day-to-day, how do I coach this team to be a better hockey team? And I think that's carried through under Derek Lalonde so far. And so I think that's an interesting way to, see how the Wings coaching staff potentially is incorporating it in that short term. For me, though, what's most fascinating, and I think what's the key across the NHL, is how these teams are incorporating this data, this information, into making long-term decisions. Because ultimately, that's how you set yourself up for stability, for years to come. And so that was very interesting to get Yzerman to be able to talk a little bit more. Granted, he didn't say all that much. He said a lot of words to not say, too many things, but as is his, typical response format. But ultimately, it was nice to get him talking on the topic because he revealed a lot of, interesting things in terms of his understanding of the history of analytics and how, things have evolved over the last decade. And, he at one point references the change from, Corsi-dominated metrics to expected goals-dominated metrics, and kind of how things are sort of falling out of favor, and you only sort of know, a few years down the road, what was actually beneficial and what wasn't. So I thought it was at least a little interesting to be able to get him to talk on that.
To me, the long pause was kind of illuminating, actually. At the start of I asked him about it, and then kind of the 4 to 5 second pause where he definitely is going through his head of how is he going to answer this? Because he's someone who Steve chooses his words very carefully. And to be truth, and not to toot my own horn, I just think this is just reality. I don't think it was one of the questions that he had prepped for. I think he goes into, GMs know what's coming. They know you're going to ask about injuries. They know you're going to ask about this guy who's a free agent. They know you're going to ask about the coach. There's certain things I'm sure he prepped for, but I feel like it was one of those where it kind of like, I didn't expect any of these people to ask me about analytics and expected goals. And so the pause was kind of telling to me, where he on the fly was having to decide where I'm going with this answer. The thing that Steve brought up that was just interesting too, to my perspective of it, was I liked the public admission of the fluidity of this, where there's the Corsi and Fenwick and everything like that, their usage, effectiveness, how it's changed in his mind and how it's changed. And it's something too where, to me, that relates back to, I can give some real examples of this. This relates back to how coaches look at it. Because I know there was the famous, it was the Mike Babcock thing where he like famously said, like, I think guys are just shooting the puck to improve their Corsi. And I don't think that was actually the case, but it was still a metric that was flawed in the level of, you could do that in theory if you were looking for, you could boost your Corsi in that way. And so I think it was, I do think we've seen, and look at a coaching staff where in the NHL, where Corsi is effectively shot plus minus, basically, shot attempt plus minus. And it's something that if a coach looks at it now, it's more so of a pullback. I feel like coaching staffs use a lot of Corsi, things like that, as more of a pullback tool, where it's a data set over time that you need to use. It's just like the whole thing where, and I know I'm not supposed to do it on a podcast where we talk about analytics, I'm actually going to slightly defend plus minus, just very slightly. I want to be very clear. I'm going to slightly defend plus minus. Plus minus, I think, is not a very good I don't think plus minus is a good single game stat, because I think there's too much outliers. I think there's too much chaos within hockey for plus minus to begin. But as far as especially at lower levels where we talked last week about how we don't have data for this, plus minus still is, when you have a large enough sample size, it does at least start to show you something. It's just like, for example, like, I think like Bobby Orr's has a ridiculous plus minus for his career. Like, that's something that is actually reflective of his career. It's not Bobby Orr lucked into being plus 700 or whatever it is, right? So I think Corsi has kind of fallen into that realm where it's more of a pullback tool, where it's like, okay, how do I look at things over time? And it's not really a tool to be used within individual games. And I don't think coaches were ever using it within individual games, but I think a lot of the early pushback was coaches pushing back against analytics, because they're like, how can I use this tool properly from a game to game basis? So,
yeah, I think you raise a lot of important points. And I think one point that I want to highlight that you raised is how people choose to use these tools. A lot of times the application of the tool has to go through and be dealt with. Like, you have to have a solid understanding of the strengths, the limitations, and the scenarios where a tool may fit in. So just like you said, plus minus has fallen out of favor largely. There are still scenarios where it can be informative. It's exactly like you said. It's the guy who's played 1,000 games and is plus 500. Larry Robinson, you learn something about Larry Robinson. You learn something about Bobby Orr. Nick Lidstrom had his plus minus for a reason. You look at a guy like Jake Wallman, even in a small sample size this year, being such an outlier in plus minus on his team. Those are ones that are very interesting, and they're potentially informative, but also the amount of information you should glean from that is dependent on, again, the quality of the statistic, the amount of time, basically the size of the sample size that you have, and whatnot. And so I think even with Corsi, there's still benefits, to looking at it. Over the course of a season, if you outshoot a team, by 200, 300, you should have won most of those games. You should have won a majority of your hockey games. That's informative to me that you generally had the puck on your stick. And that's really as much as we should be using that information for. And I think that's the key is don't try and paint a finer stroke than you can with the tool that you have. Paint the broad stroke, do what you need to do. But if you go, if you try to do a little bit more than you can, it's just not going to work.
It's kind of using it to pull back, right? Like it's the thing where it's like, okay, you look at a data set and you look at a number and you're like, okay, I want to know more about that. It's I think a good example is you and I were going back and forth texting about this week where I wrote the story about Moritz Seider that ran on that ran Monday, where it's a data point where it's what you could just simply say, oh, Mo Seider had 50 more hits this season than he had last year. I think that's the exact number, 50 more hits or whatever.
Yep.
In the exact same amount of games played. And that's fine. You could just use, that could be a sentence in a story. That could be, hey, Mo Seider was more physically at 50 more hits. Well, hits are obviously once again, very subjective stat. So that's another issue, but it's something where I loved going down the wormhole of it of, okay, why? Where? How? Those are the things where it opens that up. Saying Mo Seider had 50 more hits this season, that doesn't really tell me much more. That doesn't tell me if it's based off of him being more physical or the Red Wings asking him to do more, but being able to use that as my entry point goes in. It's like something where, and I think this is kind of last week to kind of connect last week where someone asked, how can you analytically can you use things for prospects? When you're looking at guys who, if a player is if you're looking to draft a kid and you're looking in that first, second round range and he's a minus player, I'm going to want to use that as a data point to figure out why. Like that's something where it's like, like that to me is one of those where I'm going to want to figure out, like if a kid is minus 30 or whatever in whatever league, I'm going to want to use that data point as my entry into the conversation. And that's where I think Corsi and plus minus kind of live now, and a lot of these stats that can be counted like that. I like how we've kind of it's kind of really cool to be doing this and talking about this as it's evolving, because like as Steve mentioned in the clip there, where it's like we thought Corsi was important, and he didn't say it wasn't important, but obviously there's other things on Steve Yzerman's checklist of analytics that are more important. And we're going to start learning other things. Like there's other stats that by using these bigger ones, not the bigger ones, sorry, the better tracked ones, they start to open up some other things. Like to go back to you and I talking about Seider, I'd love to know, once again, this is data that we're so far down the line from getting. I'd love to know the hit success rate. Like I would love to know, like, was he converting on more hits? Like, obviously one could subjectively try to go and watch every single one of Mo's shifts from all 82 games. You could try to do that, but it's not realistic to, I'd love to, there's more data that big data allows us to get more micro data. And I think the two really work together, which brings us back to clearly Steve cares about expected goals and expected saves. He brought it up when talking about the goalies. He looks at and he talks about, and I think one of the things and one of the challenges that Steve is figuring out right now, and this conversation was prompted by, I asked him about, obviously, Ville Husso signed for next year. Who's going to be Ville's backup? You and I probably both agree Sebastian Cossa is still years away from being in that conversation. Detroit's backup goaltending was subpar this year. The goaltending in Grand Rapids was just okay. Nedeljkovic was pretty good when he went to Grand Rapids, but other than a couple prove-it games at the end of the season, he definitely had a disappointing season. And I think Steve is at the point where he's trying to separate and figure out the way of looking at Magnus Hellberg and Alex Nedeljkovic. What is the goalie's responsibility here and what is the team responsibility here? And I think that's an interesting, finding the way to split those data points and figure out that is something that, like, you want to be fly on the wall in a conversation. I'd love to be in that conversation. How you try to split, where when you look at, we take Magnus Hellberg's expected goals against, or Alex Nedeljkovic's expected goals against versus their performance, and what passes the smell test. Because there's certain things with, I think expected goals works in a lot of ways. I think those areas, because it is based on, it is very territorial based. It is very, the model looks at that. As you and Mickey had the interchange about, had the exchange about the expected by whom. Like, it's very spatially based. And I think this always brings back to me, and this is kind of like, you talk about building and going forward on this. I would, when I covered Dallas, Ben Bishop is a noted analytics hater, and one of the points he brought up that is actually fair is Alex Ovechkin on the faceoff dot to a goalie is more of an expected goal than I want to an average NHLer. Let's not throw strays at anyone right now. Like, Alex Ovechkin on that faceoff dot is an expected goal, as Ben Bishop put it. You put a guy like a Joe Pavelski in front of the net. His tip is more of, and now obviously he's adding all these different things, but it's kind of, this model is going to evolve, and it's going to be interesting to see. But for what we have right now, I think we need to appreciate it, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, that absolutely makes sense. And I like to equate it back to my background being in medicine, and that medicine's always evolving. We don't, things that we know today as potentially the best treatments for something may not be the best treatments 10 years from now. In fact, things that we think may be harmful to a patient right now may actually be beneficial once we have more research and more data and more evidence. And there are a lot of examples of that over the course of time in medicine. But ultimately, what that doesn't do is that doesn't stop us from utilizing the information that we have.
True.
And I think that's the key here with analytics. And to get on a little soapbox about this, one of my biggest pet peeves is when I see the statement, the analytics say. The analytics do not have the capacity to say anything. Okay, the analytics, it's information. Okay, and you, as the person receiving the information, are responsible for digesting it, understanding the strengths, understanding the limitations, and ultimately how you want to incorporate it, if you want to incorporate it, into your decision making. Because all information is not good information, and you have to really spend the time identifying what's truly valuable. And I think that was nice to glean a little bit from Steve in his talk in terms of they've got the things that they consider valuable, and that's what they're honing in on, and that's what they're focusing in on. And ultimately, that's what each person has to do is take an understanding of what is valuable to them, how does it add, and how does it fit with the other information that I have. And I think that's a key, not just for general managers, but, you bring up Ben Bishop. We've talked about Derek Lalonde across all three levels, here, front office, coaching, and players. How should they be using analytics? Should they be using analytics at all? I think it's an interesting question to consider.
Yeah, and I think there's a sliding scale for different players too. I think that's an important thing. I saw a really good thing, and I should have saved the tweet. I saw someone, they were talking about soccer analytics, but I didn't save the tweet, unfortunately, but someone talking about soccer analytics was anything a player does successfully, you will be able to find in the data. If you can't find it in the data, that means that's actually the outlier. Like, it's like if you're talking about, like, it's more so the fact of, and this was in soccer, but to apply it to hockey, if you're talking about defensemen right now, the big open ice, the body check has been largely replaced by the stick check. That's a data set where you look at, okay, how effective is a guy at stick checks? How effective is a guy at disrupting the puck on the rush, doing these things? And that becomes a tool. I think that one goes below the GM level. Like you're not signing a defenseman because his stick checks per 60 or that whatever. But it becomes a tool for a player who, if you can go to, and I don't know what the number is on this, but like say Derek Lalonde and Mo Seider have his off-season meeting, and they're like, "Hey, Mo, you had this many hits. We know that, and that's great. But you look at the other top defensemen across the league. You look at the Cale Makars of the world, the Victor Hedmans of the world. You want to be in that class, right? Well, in addition to the hits, which everyone can see, Victor Hedman is breaking up 3 to 4 plays a game with little simple stick checks. I think that is where it becomes a tool for players and coaches. It becomes a space where it allows the coaches to teach over time of, hey, this is where an area we want you to work on and we want you to improve. And a player, particularly if they're smart about it, they can go through and look at the things of what their peers that they aspire to be are. And I think, like, for example, if you're David Perron probably never cares about another block shot in his life. Like, right? Like David Perron's shot blocks aren't going to matter. But if it comes down to like, okay, and this is one of those where sometimes like block shots sometimes gets pulled into the plus minus conversation. Block shots are not a bad thing. It actually is block shot is an effective tool. Like I actually talked to the Winnipeg coach, Rick Bowness, earlier this week, and one of the things that he looked at as the identity of the Vegas Golden Knights before this series is the fact that they block so many shots, and that's kind of their identity, and they work for it. Like, block shots are bad. The bigger question is with block shots becomes, if you're blocking so many shots, is it because why don't you have the puck more often? It's kind of adding that nuance to it. I think players analytically need to to be able to use they need to figure out the right way to use the data, because I think some players can take data in better than others, for lack of a better word. Like there's some guys who they just need to be told to play and they need to be told what to do. They don't need to know the numbers. They just need to be told this. There's others that will take the numbers in and use that and apply it. And I don't think we're at the spot where it's going to be used game to game, even week to week in season. But I think we are getting closer and closer to the proper data set that allows a coach and a GM to talk to a guy in the off season during you've had 3 or 4 days between games to talk about things that you can try to work on where there's been enough sample size to prove it. Because otherwise it'll be like, everyone's always going to have those outliers. Like, oh, you blocked 6 shots that game. I don't want to go use that as an awful. But if all of a sudden you've over 30 games, you've blocked 180 shots, that's 6 shots per game. Like, you're all of a sudden like, oh, this is either good, or you're a coach and you're like, well, and you don't tell the guy to stop blocking shots, but as a coach, you then look like, is this a good or a bad stat right now? That's where the coach has to decide in that moment.
Yeah, I think you bring up a couple of good points, and what I want to tie this back into is something you said earlier in terms of understanding short-term versus long-term. And I think right now, if you look at the available metrics that we have, a lot of them are geared to being more informative in the long term than they are in the short term. And that largely has to do with just not having enough of a sample size in the short term to be able to draw large sweeping conclusions. You know, if you ask a question as simple as which goalies are good, it's tough because one season a goalie may have a ridiculous year, and then the following year they may fall off of, a cliff. You look at a guy like Sergei Bobrovsky, who's yo-yoed between Vezina and backup. In terms of, his level of performance over the years. And then you look at guys really that have been consistently good, like a Vasilevsky, like a Lundqvist, and those guys are quite rare. And what we ultimately needed was we needed a large amount of data or a large sample to know effectively that they were good players. And so I think a lot of what we have available slants towards a long-term benefit. And with that being said, if you sort of look at the 3 levels that we talked about, the front office, the coaching staff, and the players, my bias is really it should be most impactful at the front office level. roster construction, market inefficiencies. How are you finding a way to pay players for maybe undervalued performance that they've been able to add over the course of their career and construct a roster that takes advantage of that? We've seen teams like Colorado do this really well with Val Nichushkin, obviously not sticking in Dallas and then all of a sudden ending up in Colorado, and he's having a tremendous year because they identified some underlying aspects of his game. We're able to sign him for cheap. He helps him win a Stanley Cup. There's loads of examples of guys like that over the course of the NHL where teams have been able to do that. And that's where I think the slant towards analytics should be in terms of where they should primarily be used is at that front office level. I think once you get down to the coaching level, like you talked about, Sean, a lot of it has to be, almost teaching guys, putting it in a digestible format where the coach understands, okay, if I alter this aspect of my system, you and I were talking about the 1-2-2 versus the 1-1-3 and kind of what you give up, where the plays are going to be made and what the numbers ultimately look like. It almost has to be presented in that format of this is what's going to be digestible to the coach and then potentially actionable. And then finally, the lowest user, in my opinion, should be the player. Because right now, with what we've got available, very little of it is actionable at the player level. There's maybe some things where you can say, for guys that have access to the tracking data, okay, if you curl and drag from this location as opposed to snap the puck, you may increase your probability of scoring. And now that player makes a change and they start looking to adjust their release. Look at a guy like Austin Matthews who has such a deceptive release, and he's worked a lot on that. Guys like Jason Robertson have done that as well. That's potentially an area. You look at how goalies have adopted the RVH a lot more from below the goal line and moving out. That's another potential area where it's actionable. But if you don't have instances like that, I sort of agree with Ben Bishop. It's kind of, you got to largely ignore it and do what you're doing unless someone's instructing you on an actionable thing you can do to improve your outcomes.
And I think from a player perspective, I think if anything right now, it stands as something for you to find your own flaws. And so I have, I can take a look at, I have Instat data right now where I can look at all of the pucks that have gone in against a goalie, and you can look, and if all of a sudden you're letting in, because teams track this, right? And I know a lot of times actually the goalie coach's job is, the goalie coach is kind of grouped into part of the analytics department, unintentionally, where they're almost, many times the goalie coach is the one who is prepping the report on the opposing goalie of hey, he's weak on the glove side, or he's weak low blocker, or whatever, because they can track the data where it's okay, hey, of the last 12 goals he let up, 6 have gone high blocker, right? Just things like that, where I think from a player perspective, it helps you to start find some deficiencies in your game and help you to assess that. If you look at a lot of if you look at the Hockey Viz heat charts, if you were a player, and I don't want it to change how you approach each day, but all of a sudden you're looking and the red blob of good, and if you're seeing that, you're okay, I want to know why that's happening there and not here. And maybe you use that as to change something, and maybe you don't. Maybe for example, shots from the outside the home plate area have become widely useless, right? From an NHL perspective, and it's part of the reason that NHL players are starting to catch on. It's one of the reasons I believe that save percentage dropped this year, is because goalies aren't getting those 6 to 7 shots from the wings that an NHL goalie saves. There's been more of the cutback, the curl and drag. There's been more and more of that. And from a player perspective, to know that you're doing something that frankly you could be doing better, wouldn't that help you? Jason Robertson's a guy who I've texted about before, where he's a computer on skates, and he's someone who he goes against every single hockey old school thinking. He didn't play a single preseason game. He was, because of the contract negotiation and everything like that, and had 109 points or whatever it was this year. And he reviews every single shift, sometimes in the game, and it's all about just data in, use that to get better. And some players it can overload. Some players I think don't like the data because we're looking at the wrong data about them. Like for example, in Red Wings land, I know Ben Sherratt catches a lot of heat, right? And I'm sure there is something that Steve will never tell us, but I'm sure there's a metric that the Red Wings look at where Ben Sherratt favors well. I don't know what that metric is, and I don't know which one or it is, but there's something that they look at, and Ben Sherratt knows what that is, but Ben Sherratt's not going to tell us either. So,
yeah, and so ultimately, what it comes down to is, you see the Hockey Viz blob chart, you see the evolving hockey goals above replacement. Sort of my stereotypical or prototypical way this works is the GM's the one looking at that, taking that to the coach and saying, find out why this guy is good and leads to these good outcomes, or what is he doing that's leading to those poor outcomes? Is he defending his blue line poorly? Does he get beat on the outside a lot? Does he, does he give up a lot of shots to the middle? Does he not, does he abandon his position well? And then from there, it's on the coach to then take that information to the player and say, hey, these are things that I think you can do that would ultimately improve your game. And what that ultimately leads to is a long-winded way of getting to a better outcome for that kind of stat that's measuring at the top. But it's taking that information and repackaging it into digestible and understandable methods for each level as it trickles on down. And I think that's really the important piece of how analytics, in my opinion, should be used in the NHL. It's because, none of us want to be boiled down to a KPI, a key performance indicator. For those of you in business and in jobs where you have those KPIs, you're not defined by those KPIs. There's ultimately other context that goes in there. And that's why this data always has to just be a piece of the information that goes in, just like a scouting report. What else can I do? What else can I look at? And how can I potentially make this team better? And that's where I think this ultimately fits.
Yeah, and I think it's something where I would love to, you talk about like fly on the wall things and building an organization. Obviously, we're still learning about what translates from one level to the next. Like we've talked about, like, systematically wise, I think Detroit and Grand Rapids have not been in lockstep the past couple of years, and that's a mistake. Like I truly this is going to, I believe teams should try to win at the AHL. I am fully in that camp, but I also don't think you should have a system where guys are doing one thing in Grand Rapids and then drive 2 hours east and all of a sudden have to, I guess driving 2 hours east would be very fast, so don't drive 2 hours east. But all of a sudden have to do something different. I would love to see, though, what type of metrics as guys advance actually translate. Like, is a guy who should we read into Simon Edvinsson's expected goals for in the AHL? Is that something we should read into? And I don't know the answer to that. That's something that we still have to figure out as we go forward in this industry. I would love to know. I would love to know the answer to that, but we don't know. Same thing goes for with, I think, Sebastian Cossa down in Toledo, where from my standpoint, watching goaltending, I actually think that ECHL is one of the toughest leagues in the world to play in because it is so scrambly. It's survival mode. There's so many mistakes. There's a lot of broken plays. I think that ECHL is actually a harder league to play in many times than the AHL. And so what from the ECHL can translate to the AHL when we look at a prospect like Cossa. I would love to. That's one of those things where it's like you'd love to get some like truth serum on Steve of like, how can we go? I want you to like ended his answer with like, I don't want to get too far deep into that. Like one day I'd love for him to go deeper into that. So
absolutely, I think we all would love for him to go a little bit deeper into that and spend a little bit more time kind of illuminating us and what he's looking at there, because you raise a lot of great points and there's a lot of things to come as we evolve, as Steve pointed out, that this is an ever fluid dynamic. And so we thank him for giving us this topic today. And we thank him again for being a listener of the show. And we, again, Steve, the open invite is there. Please join us whenever you'd like. But with that, we'll sort of conclude that segment. And if you'd like to support our show, subscribe to the Wing Wheel Podcast on Patreon. That's patreon.com/Wing Podcast. By subscribing, you're not only unlocking more great benefits like Wing Wheel Podcast exclusive Discord, which does have an Expected by Whom channel now. You'll have access to bonus episodes and more. You're also supporting us as we're part of the Wing Wheel Podcast Content Network. So with that, we'll move right into our interview of our very first guest that we're very excited to have, Shayna Goldman. All right. Well, for the very first time, we were having our very first guest on Expected by Whom, and there could be no better guest to have as our very first one than Shayna Goldman, PHWA accredited analyst for The Athletic. Basically, if I could summarize, the most diverse writer and most thorough writer that I have ever had the pleasure of knowing. So Shayna, thank you so much for taking the time to join us.
Oh my God, thank you. And thank you for that intro. Oh my God, that is so nice of you to say, because seriously, if you were writing full time, you would put all of us out of work.
Well, there's a reason that I don't want to do that, is I can't do that. I can't do the life schedule. We were just talking about it. I mean, you're saying sometimes you're up until 6 a.m. writing. No, I got to be in bed by 10:30, because then I have to chase a little tyrant around the entire rest of the day. And, you know, unfortunately, he doesn't cooperate with bedtimes after about 5:45 in the morning. So, or wake ups that are later than 5:45 in the morning. So it'll never work out. And so that's why we are so thankful to have you and all of your in-depth analysis that you can find on The Athletic. And what we wanted to bring you on here to chat about is the playoffs. You know, obviously we tend to slant towards the Red Wings a little bit, but we also like to talk about the league and all the fun that they get to have without the Red Wings for the 7th straight year. We're not going to lament that anymore, but I wanted to get your sort of perspective and kind of what storylines you're paying attention to, you know, with the playoffs happening this year. I mean, it feels like we've had a historic season in many ways with what Boston's done, but heading into the playoffs now, kind of what are you paying attention to?
A little bit of everything, right? Because that's the fun of it. Also, I'm apologizing in advance because I gave Mika a puzzle toy and she's dragging it around the floor right now, trying to dump it over. I'm so sorry. But no, like there's, you know, really interesting storylines this year. Like we have 2 rematches of last year and we already saw one take off with the Oilers and the Kings. It's one of the more intriguing matchups to me because both teams are so much better than last year. And then on the flip side of the other rematch, we have the center of the universe, the Toronto Maple Leafs taking on the Lightning. The one team that's had months to prepare for this, right? Like they're the only team that knew their opponent for so long. And here it is, you know, 3 months, let's say, of preparation they had for this team. How are they going to make sure that this is a different ending? Like, that to me brings a lot of intrigue, those 2 matchups. But like literally there's something to like about every series, right?
Yeah, I mean, without a doubt. Go ahead, John.
You're right there. You're right there. I mean, well, clearly this is our first time having a guest on here, so we're fumbling over asking questions properly. You're right there. And as someone who grew up growing up originally as a Devils fan way back in the day, a long time ago, I'm curious to pick your brain as someone who's right there to see. We're going to get Devils Rangers tonight. Obviously, this will come out after Game 1. Timestamp that, everyone. Like, getting that series, getting those 2 teams playing in a game where obviously you'd love to see them play later in the playoffs. But when you look at that series, what are you watching? When you're watching those 2 teams play, obviously it's a good time for hockey in the greater New York area.
Yeah, I feel like this is a series I know pretty well. I pay a lot of attention to both teams. I really am curious how the series goes. There's so many different elements to it that are intriguing to me. So, like, as a big picture thing, there's 2 teams that have my attention this postseason. It's the Seattle Kraken and it's the New Jersey Devils, because they can answer questions that I want answered, right? You know, I want to know how a rush-based team manages in the playoffs. And that's something that we're getting like little samples of each year. 2 years ago, the rush-based team to watch was Colorado Avalanche, who got stood up by the Vegas Golden Knights in the neutral zone, and they didn't have a way to play to their strengths. And they went into the offseason, they went, you know what, let's just play this patiently and continue with it, and we all know what happened from there. Then you have last year's version of it, the Florida Panthers, who were the second best rush-based team in the league to the Avalanche. A detail I think sometimes gets brushed over because we want to use the Panthers as our example. But that was a team that went against the grain at the deadline to get slower and grittier for the playoffs instead of leaning into their strengths. And we all saw how that happened, right? They tried to get away from what made them successful all year, and it burned them. And it also hurt them that their power play didn't help because you lose confidence when that's not clicking, and, you know, your high-end offensive players at even strength, it seems to impact as well. So now you have the Devils. How do they approach this? How are they different? How are they similar to those teams? They leaned into the strength at the deadline, getting Timo Meier, the best player available, right? And you look at each line and you go, well, they could probably play both ways, except for the Jack Hughes line. That's a line to me that needs that rush-based offense to thrive, I think. Maybe we're wrong because Jack Hughes is a superstar. But it's, how is their power play going to manage? And, you know, that's something that hasn't been a strength all year. If it doesn't click, is it going to hurt them at even strength? Do they panic? Do they get away from their strengths? Or are they going to get the Rangers into a track meet, which there's a good chance they can win because the Rangers got a little bit slower at the deadline. They got better. This is the best iteration of the Rangers we've seen in years. But Tarasenko and Kane aren't, you know, the most fleet of foot, and they're not perfect defensively. So, like, those are the big questions for me with that series, but then we can go into the nitty gritty and keep getting, you know, with more. Is goaltending going to be the difference maker? It absolutely could be. Vanecek's never played this workload. Shesterkin has. Shesterkin's the best in the world versus Vanecek, who, you know, doesn't have that track record, but then again, he's coming in with his best, you know, season yet. Like, there's so much to unpack with this series. So sorry for rambling on it. I just have a lot of thoughts on it.
No, it's a fascinating series to me because as someone who I covered the Stars during the Lindy rough years, and I saw Lindy's team in Dallas basically fall apart because what worked in the regular season fell apart through a combination of goaltending, an untimely injury, Achilles injury to Tyler Seguin, and basically allowing the St. Louis Blues to dictate the style that basically stopped Dallas from being able to. And so when you look at that Devils team and you look at, for lack of a better word, has Lindy, did Lindy, when you look at the Devils now and you look at back what the Stars did during the Lindy era when they were at their best, has Lindy changed? Is it just different players? Like when you look, what are the pitfalls? Like I look at this Devils team, it's fascinating to me how do they avoid the pitfalls the Stars did when they had the best record in the West, but flamed out in the second round?
Yeah, no, it's a really good question because for me, like after Lindy left the Stars, he went to the Rangers, and I didn't like how he worked as a defensive coach. I thought he was too one-dimensional. I didn't think that he brought enough, you know, modern, innovative ideas to play. With the Devils, it seems he's a little bit more willing to listen to the numbers, and, you know, he works a little bit more with their analytics department, which surprised me when I was told it last year, but, you know, he does want to have all the information, so credit to him on that. The thing with the Devils that's so interesting is, like, Lindy Ruff almost got fired last year, and so many players did vouch for him, which is kind of interesting. I don't know how much of a tactician he is in New Jersey, and it feels like he's not, you know, nearly as much as anymore. Like, they changed their assistant coaches, and we see the impact of the assistants, right? Because they're different stylistically. The power play was a wreck before that. It's a little bit better. You know, defensively, they've adjusted from, you know, when it was Nazardine to what it is now. Like, there's key differences in this team from this to last year, yet the head coach is the same. So for me, I wonder how much he's the people manager versus the tactician. Has he changed his vision? Has he allowed different assistants to come in and give him ideas, or they're just better at executing his ideas? Like, that's what I'm curious about, because they're not entirely different than last year, but they have cleaned it up a lot. And it's tough because you look at last year's team and you go, well, the goaltending, like, you had to focus on what was going on in front of it and before the game started to spiral out of control, because you really can't take anything from those games at that point. So I'm really curious to see how this shakes out in the postseason. Andrew Brunette is the assistant that works with the offense and the power play there. And he's someone I wasn't the biggest fan of in Florida last year. I thought he got handed the keys to a very well-oiled ship. I don't think he had the answers when he had to make the adjustments in the postseason. It felt like, for me, he wasn't ready for that big of a role as a head coach. So being, you know, an assistant and associate coach, I think is better catered to him. But I am curious for him too. Like, if the forwards aren't clicking to their strengths, if the power play is not going, does he have the adaptability? Because last year he didn't, but now it's in a totally different capacity. So there's like really good questions to ask here. How much has Lindy Ruff has evolved? How adaptable can they be? I hope we get to see some answers.
It's interesting too. You go down like the coaching route. I'm sorry, Prashanth. You go down the coaching route, and it's the different styles and of the way like. Certain coaches have more of I'm the hands-on guy, I'm handling everything. And there's other ones who become more of it's the macro big picture. And I know you've done some good work tracking various coaching responsibilities and how and as you look at that, and as someone who is kind of, I believe at one point built an entire database looking at these things, like what's the balance? Like as you've tried to assess that and try to figure out what's the right way from your perspective as one looks at this?
I think it really does depend on situation, and I think it depends on willingness to listen to other ideas, right? So if you're John Tortorella or Lindy Ruff, it does feel very much like they are the people manager. Like that's their job. They have general styles of play they want in place, but it does seem like they rely on the X's and O's from their assistants. And I think that can work out well. In some cases, you have the head coach being a little bit more hands-on. I think Bruce Cassidy's an example of that. Jim Montgomery seems like a good example of that, of coaches who have ideas of what they want and kind of know how to implement it, and they're a little bit more involved in it. I think in today's game, it does help to be a little bit more involved in it if you're a head coach. But I think the biggest thing is knowing what your strengths are and knowing how to work with it, right? The smartest coach in the room can be the person who comes in and goes, I am great at this. And being truthful, like that's his strength and leaning into it. But if you can walk in and say, I can manage a bench like no other, I can listen to ideas, and I know I can't write up this play, I can't draw it up, I need someone to do it for me, and you let that person handle it and you have that like collaborative attitude, you could be the best coach in the world. It's all about knowing what you can and can't do, I think. And that's why like the other side of, we're talking about the Devils and Rangers matchup as their jumping off point. Like in New York, you have a head coach who isn't very adaptable and whose assistants, some of them, I don't think are as good tactically as they could be to complement that. So it kind of feels like the opposite. It feels like Lindy Ruff is a little bit more willing to listen to ideas, and I could be completely off on that, versus Gerard Gallant, who I don't think is nearly as much. I think that he can be a good coach. He can optimize the lineup, but there's a lot of stubbornness that you have to cut through first. So, it's two old school coaches, but you see how they, differentiate themselves, and that to me might be a difference here.
So sort of jumping from the Devils Rangers series, I think there's two other coaches that are very interesting in terms of how they manage their players, their personnel. One up in Boston that you already mentioned, Jim Montgomery, but then the other down in Carolina, Rod Brindamore. And sort of looking at those two teams, I think it'll be, sort of two storylines that I'm paying attention to. Obviously, as you have the Boston Bruins just setting an NHL record, 65 wins, and, the historic season that they had. But we also have the history of the two teams that they just beat, the 95-96 Wings and the 19 Tampa Bay Lightning. Neither one of them had any sort of playoff success. And so can the Bruins sustain that all the way through? And then down in Carolina, I think it's flown under the radar a little bit, but this is the top 5-on-5 score-adjusted Corsi team ever, going back to 07-08 by more than 1%. Second highest 5-on-5 expected goals for percentage, but no Max Pacioretty, no Andrei Svechnikov. So, where do they score their goals? So I'm curious as sort of what your perspective and takes are for those two series.
Yeah, so with the Bruins, I really like what Jim Montgomery came in and did, because you had a very good team already. You had a good foundation in Boston. You had elite players, but it does seem like he made some meaningful tweaks to how players, play their games, or how they change their approaches. It just feels like he's handled it in a really good way, because we're seeing players thrive. Jake DeBrusk and Charlie Coyle and those types of players alongside the elite talent that they have. I think the Bruins are a favorite. It feels a little bit different than the Tampa Bay Lightning, who got swept by the Blue Jackets, because I think this Bruins core knows what it takes to be here a little bit more than what the Lightning did at that time. And, it seems like they're grounded through all their success somehow, which is pretty impressive. For the Bruins too, the Panthers feel like they could disrupt things 100%, but you just look at the bottom of their lineup and you're like, That's what you're putting out there every day. That's not good. And not up front, not on defense. But it does make, you have Paul Maurice, who is not my favorite head coach, going against someone who I think might be coach of the year too. Like, it can be the difference in a series. But with the Bruins, I think maybe the most interesting aspect is going to be like the defense, because we know they're good offensively. We know the Panthers are good offensively. We know the Panthers aren't great in net. We know the Bruins are, but it comes down to like defense for me with this series, the strength of the Bruins, the weakness of the Panthers, and the penalty kill and things like that. We saw the power play legitimately kill the Panthers last year, and now you're going up against one of the best penalty kills in the league. Like, there's so many different elements to it. And even without Bergeron, we thought they were a little bit worse defensively last night than I think what we all anticipate them to be, but they can manage. And then once they get, it doesn't matter the hurdles you throw their way. There's so much depth there, and it just feels like they can pull it together. Thanks. Thank you for chiming in. She slept through most of that game, so she doesn't have many thoughts. For the Canes Islanders, it's so interesting. The Hurricanes are... Sorry, hold on. Can you please not? Sorry. So for the Canes Islanders, you have a team that is like the product of a system, right? Like, who else in the league can you point to and say, look at the system, you could throw anybody into it and come up with these results? Literally no one. Like, it's so interesting, like Brent Burns being in the Norris conversation, because literally anybody that you throw into his slot has done so well. And it's not a knock against him. Individually, he's been incredible this year, but like, how much of it is being in a position to succeed right there? But for the Hurricanes, it's literally who's going to have the better offense in this series, right? Like, that's what it comes down to. And the Hurricanes are the team in the regular season that have that, but they're going to go against Sorokin. And then for the Islanders, offense isn't a strength. It never has been. It never will be. And that's fine, because this is a team that can thrive in the playoffs. Can they get through the Canes defense to generate something? Can they get through that penalty hill to generate something? Last night they couldn't. The power play sucks as it is, but then to go against such a good penalty kill, you're like, what are we doing here? It feels like Brind'Amour is a really good people manager, and it does feel like he is someone that can keep things right in the room. And he can also, I mean, look at the forecheck they've built. Look at, anyone could come in and play it that way. So it really is an impressive team there, but like, the finishing talent, it's always going to come back to it. I wish that we didn't have to go back to the same storyline as we had before. Like, I don't want it to be that the finishing talent is the constant conversation, but it feels like it has to be, right?
With Carolina, I always hear all the time, right? Like, we always hear it's a copycat league, right? We always hear that. But then we hear about how, and you talk to players all the time about how Carolina kills teams on the forecheck. They go, you ask someone about playing against Carolina, and you talk about it's different against playing any other team in the league. Why isn't anyone copycatting Carolina, in your view?
That's a good question, right? Like, playoff styles and regular season styles. Here's what we're taking notes from. It can be that you need to build your own stars. You need a good goaltender, or center depth leads the way, or, accent your team at the deadline. You can take away something from every contender. But the Kane system is something no one's trying to replicate. They're going, we need to be faster in this league, and they're taking the right notes from the teams like, Colorado, like speed and skill leads the way. You need to have dimension to your offensive creation. You need to be able to generate off the forecheck. You need to be able to sustain offensive pressure off the cycle. You need to have rush-based offense. With the Canes, it is impressive to me that nobody's copied their style of play. It does seem like some teams recognize the importance of the penalty kill and how you can add dimension to it. And it's something you know pretty well, right? About on-the-fly deployment on the penalty kill and who you should put in that position. Like, if you put your more offensive players on the second penalty kill unit, you can kind of disrupt top power play units a little bit easier because you have the fresh legs to go up against them. If you have more offensive players on the penalty kill, they can read power plays a bit better, so they can break up plays and anticipate what's going to happen next. There's only so many power play strategies, and it feels like other teams in the league are starting to notice that. We see Toronto, because it's all about the Leafs, having a little bit more dimension on their penalty kill. We see other teams taking note in that. Players like Anton Lundell are killing penalties in Florida. Like, that's what you need to have. it seems like that's a positive note they're taking from the Canes. Also, that defense, if you can get by with average goaltending because you have really good defense, like, that's another note. But the system, having a system that literally anybody can step in and thrive, and have it be this system that you don't need to carry the puck in constantly, which is something we all preach that you should do in today's game, that you can play that chip and chase game if you have that foundation no one else is picking up on. And it is really interesting. I wonder if the Canes need to win with it because people are sick of the Corsi Canes. Oh, they can create all the shots, or oh, now they have the scoring chances to match the shots, but they don't have the results. They don't have the success. They don't have the goals. I wonder if that's what's holding everybody back, but it is so interesting because you would think more people would go, well, it's working for them for years. But I feel like everyone just looks at the Canes and goes, it works for them, but what do you have? What do you have tangibly from it? Might be what's stopping other teams.
It's interesting, too, because the perspective is, like, so often we talk about in this league, like, we look at the Stanley Cup as the copycat. It's like, oh, the team wins the cup, that's the one we copycat. But in reality, so much of the motive from owners in this league is not necessarily to win the cup. Obviously, winning the cup is great, but the dirty secret of this league is you got to reach the second round of the playoffs to make money. And that's something where I feel like if more owners had involvement, they look at, okay, well, Carolina plays the systems that will get us in. It plays us a system that buys us the lottery ticket. It buys the system that buys us at least 4 home games in the playoffs. It's one of those where I've always wondered why, as you bring up, why does it take the cup for the copycat thing to really take impact? It's kind of two different lines of thinking that seemingly should collide, but for whatever reason, they don't.
Yeah. No, it should be, for me, so each year, 3 years, 2 years, whatever it is, I've written something when we get to the final 8 teams on what we can learn from contenders. And I feel like that final 8 or the final 4, even more so, are the teams that you should be taking notes from because, I mean, we're talking about a game that a lucky bounce can decide who goes to the cup final, right? Like, it could be a 7-game series that goes to triple overtime that are 1-0 game. You know what I mean? Like, it's like the Islanders against the Tampa Bay Lightning, how they went to the Eastern Conference Final and they were so close to making it to the Stanley Cup Final numerous times. We shouldn't throw out what they did because they didn't make it. They were as close as could be, and then the Tampa Bay Lightning goes on to win. There's things to take, but I think also the tricky thing too is teams knowing what to take. You know, the Tampa Bay Lightning win the Stanley Cup twice. Let's talk about their third line. And there is something to talk about with the third line, and that is you should be finding your own version of Barclay Goodrow and Blake Coleman cheaply and not overinvesting, you know, monetarily in those types of players. And then you build your own forward depth with that. If it's like, if you can spot those players on bad teams and kind of extract their value and then figure out how they'll fit for you, that is good business right there. Take that note, but it's not the takeaway. It's not, you know, this team had a good third line. This is, you know, I feel like everybody gets so distracted by a narrative that they take the wrong things anyway from the top team. So it's like there's 2 challenges in it: who you should be learning from and what you should actually be taking from it.
So shifting over to a team that never has to worry about being copycatted because they haven't won a Stanley Cup in 53 years, the Toronto Maple Leafs, and that series against Tampa. I mean, this has to be the year, right? I mean, you've got a team in Tampa that's been to the Stanley Cup Finals the last 3 years. They're tired. They sort of crashed and burned down the stretch in the regular season to close it out. This has to be the Leafs' year to get out of the first round, right?
In theory, sure. But, like, you know, this is why we play the game, right? Like, the Leafs are so interesting to me because everything's about the Leafs. But, like, how they approach the deadline is interesting too. You know, like every year they bring in a former captain. And I actually really like the choice of Ryan O'Reilly here because I like the versatility he brings. The injury was really unfortunate because we didn't get to see him as the 3C, and it would have been nice to see him there a little bit more consistently to figure out like what's the best role for him. Can he drive a line on his own? But even how they brought him in and they were like, okay, you're new to our lineup and you're learning on the fly. Here's the best position in the lineup you could possibly be in to get caught up on the fly. Like, I like how they approach that. They brought in 1 million defensemen, though, and you look at it and go, how could you possibly, like, figure out the best formation when you have so many options constantly? Like, there is that going to make up for what you have in net? You know, or, ooh, look at the risk that they took on these goaltenders when the next 2 years are so important. And Samsonov's been a great bet. Murray, I thought it would be a better bet, honestly, if he could stay healthy, but the injuries are not great. The level of play hasn't been great. There's so many different factors. And then you have, did they invest too much in their core? And are their top players good enough? Which I think is a load of crap, personally. I think their top players are just fine, and you should invest in that. Yes, they spent a little bit much. The Tavares contract was a little unnecessary, but like everything else, I just think it's overblown. But you look at everything and go, how don't they beat the Lightning? The Lightning are reeling at 5-on-5. The big player they spent way too much on isn't even in the lineup. The player we all figured Game 7, it's going to come down to a Tanner Janogel, and we're all going to forget about the cost of acquisition. Like, we can't have that happen now. It's Vasilevsky, though, is the difference for me. And I don't think he has to be perfect. I think it's, if it gets to Game 6 or 7, watch out for him. When, he's facing elimination before that Stanley Cup final to the Avalanche. I think it was 8 games. He saved about 17 goals above expected. He only allowed 2 goals altogether. Like, he is who you want in those situations, and this has been his toughest workload yet, and he's been at his best level. Might the long playoff runs wear him down at some point? Sure, that totally could happen, but he's the difference for me. I think that he can support the team enough, and we have to see what the Leafs learned from the Lightning last year, and I am not a big narrative and whatever person. I like data, I like support, I like things like that, but the will over skill was so increasingly clear as that series went on. You saw the Lightning give it their absolute all in those last 2 games, and it was that extra oomph that the Leafs were missing. Do they have it now? Like, I don't know. Do they know? I don't even know.
Vasilevsky's, to me, is someone who, in a weird way, we could talk about someone who we talk about best goalie in the world. We talk about that category, and somehow at the same time is underrated. Like, we look at, like, it's the very weird space where you can live in both realms. Like I've talked to people who they'll look at that, they look at what Tampa's done and the things he's been able to smooth over, whether it's this year or past years, that allow that team to become what it did. Like, it's one of those where, like, being in Detroit, right? You look and everyone's like, hey, we talk about the Yzer plan, and they talk about like going down there, and at the end of the day, Steve's never going to draft another Andrei Vasilevsky. Like, I know that's not really a question. It's just more of a commentary that is leading into a leading thought that hopefully someone picks up and stops me from talking here.
So basically what you're saying is goaltending is super, super important, right? And it's very, very hard to get that right goaltender nailed down. But I think in this particular series, I think, Shayna, you laid it out nicely, that it really does come down to, what Vasilevsky shows up and how good can he be, and what did the Leafs learn. And so I think interestingly, shifting out west, there are a couple of other teams over there that did find their goalies as well. One in particular, quite well, Sean, the Dallas Stars and Jake Ottinger. They obviously dropped a tough one in overtime against Minnesota. But what do you make of that series, Shayna? Anything that stands out to you about either one of those teams, Dallas or Minnesota?
Yeah, so it's a series. Our friend Allison Lucan said was going to be boring, and she cursed us all. I didn't think it was going to be boring, but now she made it clear that it can't be. It's so big for Minnesota to come out with a win in Game 1 because their center depth really is so thin, and ironically, it's the 1C that truly isn't a 1C that ends that game. But we say center depth wins championships, and I think that it's true to a point, because you can have elite wingers, like think of a Mark Stone, that makes up for not having that center, and it's completely and totally fine. But in Minnesota, they don't have that depth up and down the lineup to make up for it. You have Kaprizov, and he's the play driver on line 1. You have Matt Boldy on line 2. But it's not like you're going into every line combination. That second line doesn't have an elite winger to balance out the fact that they don't have a center right now. So the center depth, I think, is going to be a big problem, because Eriksson Ek is one of the Wild's best players. He's very good offensively. He's elite defensively. He's hard to play against. He's good on the power play, the penalty kill. He draws penalties. He does every single thing you could want. And I think that that's like the key right here, because they're so evenly matched, right? Like in goal, they're evenly matched. We have the breakout star of last postseason versus the potential breakout goalie of this season. We have 2 elite defenses. We have 2 good penalty kills. We have 2 elite power plays. And then we have 2 totally different forward groups. We have the Stars, who were a 1-line team last year, versus the Wild, who became a 2-line team and then lost Eriksson Ek. So for me, it's all about who can create more offense consistently and who can get through each other's defense and goaltending. It felt like the Stars should have won that game in so many ways, but even as I'm watching double overtime last night, I'm like, it's going to come down to like the Wild finally get their shot. And that's it. Like, it just felt that way after the 2 penalty kills. So we'll have to see how the next couple games, differ from that, especially now that they're going to be shorthanded without Pavelski, I would assume, for a minute.
With Dallas, I wanted to pick your brain because he's played for so many teams already in a young career. What's your read on Max Domi?
I'm not the biggest fan of Max Domi. I think that he has been overhyped and overrated his entire career because of his name. That's really not his fault, but like, it's a fact of the matter. And I think a lot of teams can get so excited about someone who brings some skill to the lineup and some physical play. Like, think of how we talk about Brad Marchand and Matthew Tkachuk, and rightfully so, but they have the elite skill that Domi doesn't. It's even when he has the scoring pop like he does this year, the play below the surface isn't where it should be. I think in Dallas, some of the defensive weaknesses can be fine. They have that structure. So the Stars defense, I think, might mask some of his weaknesses. There we go. That's all I got.
We have tonight to the series. We start with Seattle. You talked about Seattle being interesting and everything like that. When you look at that team, obviously there's the storyline. There's the second year franchise in the playoffs, and that storyline makes them interesting already. But what are the things for you that, when you kind of mentioned, hey, I'm really interested in watching this team, what about Seattle pops for you on that?
Seattle for me is super interesting because in the playoffs, we know that star power tends to lead the way. Top lines. We talk about you need 4 balanced lines because you do, to a point, right? Like, it's so important to have 4 lines. You don't want it that you put out a 4th line, they generate absolutely nothing, kill all the momentum, and your top line starts in the defensive zone or something. But star power and the top of your lineup tends to be more impactful in the postseason than the bottom of your lineup. So Seattle's a team that's been pushing against that all year. They have bits of star power, right? They have Matty Beniers, who could be a star. You have Vince Dunn, who's having a breakout season finally, who is starting to show star power. But is that Cale Makar caliber? Absolutely not. Is it Nathan McKinnon, Mikko Rantanen? No, it's not. At the end of the day, it's just not. I think that the Kraken have a really interesting team here, and we're going to see. They have, the most unique goal scorers in the league and things like that. Like, how much is that going to help them versus hurt them? Because at the top of your lineup, you're going to go, well, it's Matty Beniers against Nathan McKinnon, and they legitimately just can't stack up. So it's going to be so interesting to see how this all shakes out. If the Kraken can really make an impact here, what is going to kill them potentially is the fact that, their power play is not good. They overperformed at the beginning of the season, but like, the offensive creation just isn't there consistently. But they've managed even without that. It doesn't seem to drag them down as much as you would think it should. Someone like Vince Dunn, creates like 70% of his scoring at 5-on-5. The same is true for Eberle and Beniers. Can that continue into the postseason? If it can, that's a huge advantage, right? If it doesn't matter that you're, going on the power play and you're not losing momentum from it, then by all means, just keep going, keep doing what you do, because they have a bit of a power kill that's going to have to break up an elite power play. Like, there's so many different aspects of it. So is it going to be the star power of Colorado that we know is a little bit hurt, right? There's no Landeskog. Nichushkin's had an in and out year, unfortunately. So is that going to hurt Colorado too much? Or is it the fact that Seattle just has waves of offense because their 4th line can produce? I really want to see how this one goes.
When you look at Seattle, and this is something where, once again, coming from a Detroit perspective on this, in Detroit, it's not going. Steve's long-term plan is not going to be okay with just make the playoffs every year. That's one of the things that essentially ended Ken Holland's time in Dallas was the commitment to the playoff streak, as opposed to what looked like trying to win the Stanley Cup. So when you look at Seattle, and I know a lot of people will be like, oh, well, you could try to do what Seattle did. They got in rather quickly and everything like that. Is there a difference when you're building a team between building a team that can actually build a playoff streak and a team that can actually win a Stanley Cup? And I'm going to just connect this back looking, because Detroit, the fandom, at the end of the day, if Steve doesn't at least get close to a cup, the whole Yzer plan is going to be for naught, because the 7 years, all of a sudden, the 7-year playoff streak and whatever is just going to feel like, why did we go through that when we could have at least bought lottery tickets to get in and maybe win a raffle when we could have?
Yeah, like, I think even though, like, the Kraken make it in round, season 2, they're in the playoffs, they still are playing the long game. This team had all the assets in the world to make a difference at the to make an impact at the deadline, and they chose not to. So I think that's something really important to remember too, because they knew what to do in those situations. They knew, don't just leap because you're here, just keep building for the future. And that's something that I think Detroit should take note of. There was patience at the right time. And, with the Red Wings, they were proactive with a lot of their approach this season. And I know it like really sucks when you look at the end result of how the season ended, but like it made a lot of sense. Just recoup assets. I think we were all waiting for another big move. And that's the thing that we're all going to be looking for this summer. And if it doesn't come, fans should rightfully be disappointed in Detroit right there in the Yzer plan. But, with the Lightning, the approach was patience. It took them a very long time to build up that core that they drafted 10 years before they were this cup contender. It took time for them to put all the pieces together and then know when to spend. And that's like, I think, a really big thing to take away from top teams like the Lightning, like the Avalanche. The Avalanche didn't invest heavily at the deadline until last year. The Lightning didn't invest heavily at the deadline until the year before they won, or 2 years before they won. That's when they really started to spend. So I think that's something that like Detroit fans can kind of look at and go, well, there is a patient approach, but it is going to get to a point where if the Yzer plan doesn't work out and you're 10 years deep, you can start asking questions. You don't have to hold him on the pedestal because of who he was as a player to Detroit and what he built in Tampa Bay, because it doesn't always translate. You could look at around the league at anybody and say, hey, well, Lou Lamoriello won championships in New Jersey. He didn't anywhere else. Because it phases out what you do if you don't evolve. I think Yzerman's a different situation because it does feel like he can evolve and he has a more modern approach than Lou Lamoriello. So it's not like, well, he's outdated and that's it for him. It's two totally different situations. But, just because someone manages it one place, it doesn't mean they're going to somewhere else. So, it'll be interesting to see with that. And the same conversation come up with Seattle. Ron Francis had all the time in the world with the Canes. He was very patient in his team building. They don't have a championship to show for it either. If they won tomorrow, a lot of it's going to be off the back of what Francis put together before Don Waddell took over. We have to keep that in mind too. But sometimes a general manager's signature sticks around. Sometimes it doesn't. It really depends on the situation. So, there has to be some patience for Detroit. It feels like last year, they went for defense. They had a very specific vision in the offseason. We saw how it didn't pay off this year. And now it's like, okay, the next steps are here. Sure, they were not, there were 3 potential disruptors in the East. You had the Senators, the Red Wings, the Sabres. The Sabres were the last to be eliminated. They were the biggest surprise of them all. But the fact that Detroit and Ottawa made things interesting when they did was a step forward. So it's all about building on that and just ensuring they don't take a step back right now.
Yeah, absolutely. And, sort of shifting over to the other expansion team that maybe went about this in the opposite way of Seattle and decided that, hey, we were good the first year and let's just continue spending as aggressively as we can and adding over in Vegas. And now you see they've got, the 23rd ranked prospect pool by Scott Wheeler. They've got only 10 picks in the next 2 years. But hey, they're still here in the playoffs, and they've got some results to show for it in terms of, already making a Stanley Cup final. So what do you make of, Vegas this year? Are they the real deal? Do they have the capacity to come out of the West? Or are we looking at potentially another first-round disappointment where they potentially get goalied here against Winnipeg?
I think that I think that they can make... Oh, my God. Sorry. I think, honestly, they can make it out of this series. When we wrote the previews, I was kind of surprised to see just how closely ranked the Jets and the Golden Knights are below the surface. It's like when you start looking them up, you're like, oh, wow, they're really similar in expected goals for. But then you see the differences, finishing talent, or they're really similar. They're different in what the shots they allow back, but the quality is where they get really similar. Not the exact areas, but the expected goals against. Like, there's a lot of similarities between these two teams. I think the big edge that Winnipeg has in net, and that's going to be really interesting to see how much they need him to be perfect to have a chance in this series, and I think we're going to see a lot of that because up front you have defensive weaknesses, you have some defensive weaknesses on the back end that really showed through in the second half, and you have a lack of accountability for the players and the coaches, so that's going to be an issue. And then the other factor is I think the Golden Knights offense is a little bit more dimensional. They're really good off the rush. They're good off the cycle. The Jets are not good off the rush at all, and they're not good at defending the rush. So that's something that I think Vegas can expose if they're at their best. And with Mark Stone back, they might be. But, like, there's going to be questions, too. Like, what caliber is Mark Stone at? You know, if he's... Right now, he's starting out on the third line. If he's third line caliber throughout the postseason, you have a problem. But if he's the Mark Stone that you know he can be, then you're in good shape. So... You know, it'll be interesting to see how the series looks. I think the big question is going to be what Jack Eichel does in his playoff debut. It is crazy we're talking about him and this being his playoff debut, but, like, you know, do all the crazy moves that they've made all this time pay off? Like, the Vegas Golden Knights to me are broken into three categories. You have the original misfits, you have the big additions, and you have just some random guys that they have to fill out their lineup with because they have to manage cap space and they don't have the prospects to really do it anymore. So it's going to be interesting to see how that shakes out and how it pays off for them because they've been so aggressive. I don't know if they necessarily have built the right way. I think it's good that they go for the big players. I think that they recognize you need elite talent, and when they had the opportunity to jump at it, they've gone for it, which you can't always do if you don't draft them yourself. Like, elite talent doesn't grow on trees, but the way they've gone about things is so interesting. Like, Laurent Prashanth is starting in net when it's like, well, you had a goalie tandem that you broke apart for cap reasons that you never needed to do. You made mistakes, and if that bites them, we'll have to see what they learn from it or if they just get even more aggressive. Like, they don't care about the future, they care about the right now, and that's clear and that's fine. I don't have a problem with the team doing that as long as, you know, they're committing to it. It's the same with the Islanders. They do not care about the future. Lou Lamoriello is not looking out 5 years from now. He's not going to be, you know, managing probably in 5 years. He does not care, and that's fine. You know, the Golden Knights is not the same situation with their management group, but they know what they want. So let's see if the destruction they made along the way to get to this point is what bites them, or if they're going to have like a legit shot. I just don't see them being the best in the West, personally. I think teams like the Kings have the advantage. I think the Oilers do, the Stars, the Avs. But, you know, I don't mind being proven wrong. They're exciting. They play a really exciting brand of hockey, and I think that them going far could really disrupt some things. I just don't. It's the worst iteration of the Golden Knights yet, and it's because of what they've done. They have the most stars that they've ever had in one place, but you just look at how they've depleted things elsewhere.
It's something too. Like I was talking to someone about this the other day, where one of the people always look at Vegas, and people who don't pay a lot of attention will like, oh, they got a great great expansion draft, right? And I think one of the biggest things is we've acknowledged here is they've aggressively manipulated the cap more than any team in NHL history. The amount of times, and I don't have the numbers in front of me, the amount of times they've played with 17 skaters just to get to the emergency. They were doing this before Toronto was dressing University of Toronto kids as backups in Tampa Bay, which, once again, how they're getting those kids on the plane and they're randomly there is a whole nother fun thing to go down. But I look at the thing, and this is going to be a cross-sport thing, and I hope I don't lose everyone on this concept, but the way Bill Foley wants a team to be run is because everything starts from the owner in many cases. Some owners are a little bit more hands-off than others, but in many cases, people don't realize how often the owner is actually pulling strings, and every GM technically has a different job description. In Detroit, Steve Yzerman from the Illiches still has a pretty blank slate, where the team I covered in Dallas, every decision Jim Nill makes has to go through Tom Ghilardi. There's different levels of owner involvement. And Bill Foley's ownership in Vegas has clearly shown, I want to spend big, you swing big, you may miss big, but you swing big. I am fascinated to see what happens when his approach goes over to the UK, because he just bought Bournemouth, right? Like, it's a system where right now Vegas can swing big and miss big, manipulate cap, all that stuff, and still be in the NHL the next year. I'm trying not to lose people on this, but the whole concept, I look at Bill Foley and the way his ownership model is run. He's bought a team in a system where that's not going to work, because if he misses big, all of a sudden he'll be out of the league. And I hope I didn't lose everyone on that tangent, but it's just a thought I always think about with Bill Foley and the way he wants to run his teams and how it's run, because it's all about being flashy. It's all about the show when you're at the arena. And that's how the roster is run. We've never seen an NHL team really run like this. Even when teams talk about, oh, they put together these stars or anything like that, we've never seen a team be like, they signed Alex Pietrangelo knowing we're going to play about 5 games with 11 forwards because of it.
Yeah, and like the difference is too, like we talk about teams run by star power. How did they get those stars? The Colorado Avalanche, for the most part, developed them. The Tampa Bay Lightning, they developed them. The Vegas Golden Knights didn't have the time to develop them. They went, we're just going to go buy them. I think what's interesting to me about Bill Foley, I remember like early on him saying it. He was like, I'm not a hockey expert. I don't claim to be, and I'm going to hire people who do it for me. And he hired people who know how to manipulate the cap, and he hired people who know how to find players and spot talent. Right, wrong, or sideways. He found experts, people he views as experts in each area to manage and manipulate every single loophole he can. Like, you can't do that, with his new team, but maybe he'll find experts who know how to manipulate the loopholes enough to keep them where they need to be. It's going to be really interesting, but like for Vegas, it's so fitting. And I think the thing too was, you could look at it and say, well, it was a risk, the hockey market that they chose. We never knew if Vegas was going to click. We never knew if any professional team would click in Vegas because, everyone talks about how many people come and go from the area versus actually living there. And I think that's something that to a point gets overhyped a little bit. But, there's obviously people who live in that area all the time. But there's some true points. And I think that they had something to prove off the bat of like, you know what, we can build a franchise here and we're going to have people who love us all the time. But they probably weren't sure they'd get that if they were a really bad team off the bat, like other expansion teams. They also lucked out that other general managers handled the expansion draft so poorly. It's something that, hurt Seattle in the end because everyone learned from it. But that was like the biggest thing. Everyone was like, oh, this is a new team. They're our friends. We'll help them out. Like, no, they are your competitors. And nobody anticipated them to be such a competitor as quickly as they were. But it just all goes back to the fact that, like, if you are a good owner, right? I understand the want for like, we need to make the playoffs. I'm sure the Penguins were sitting there going, just make round one. We can make a couple $1 million and then figure out the rest there, even if we're not good enough, right? A lot of teams probably thinking, well, if we get a slightly better draft pick, it's no, we want the money, especially after the last couple of years, right? Like everybody has that priority after, not having fans in the stands and everything like that. Revenues went down. The league isn't the best at like distributing their revenues. They're not the best at projecting their revenues. There's so many flaws within the whole thing. So right now you have so many teams with even more pressure. But if you can go in and say, I want to this is my vision. I want to make a splash and this is how I want to do it. I want Vegas to be impactful off the bat. I want them to be exciting, interesting. I want them to be the team everybody's talking about, which is kind of what it feels like. And he goes, I'm going to hire people to make that happen. And here's my specialists in each area. That's not bad at all. That's not a bad way to approach it. Even if you say, well, in 3 years, you're probably going to be terrible. Look at your prospect pool, this, that, and whatever. But it doesn't matter right now. He came in, he wants his experts, and let's see what he does when they get up to that point. He might say, I'm going to find the best draft expert around and someone who's great at spotting talent outside the draft because we don't have picks and we're going to make this work. And I'm going to throw every dime I have at him and it's going to be fine because my pockets are open. It could work for them too. Who knows?
Absolutely. I mean, the Golden Knights are a very unique outlier, I think, in the history of hockey in terms of the way that they've tried to scale up and chase some of these bigger name players through free agency. It's really not something we've seen in the cap era. Sort of shifting gears to our last series to talk about a team that has lived in the draft lottery for many, many years, the Edmonton Oilers and the LA Kings. And so the Oilers suffered a heartbreaking loss to the Kings, giving up a game-tying goal with 16 seconds left and then giving up the game winner in overtime. So Shayna, is Canada's other great hope, the Edmonton Oilers. Are they going to be able to go through as so many have projected, or what are you sort of looking for here from the LA Kings to be able to upset them?
Well, actually, this is America's team, the Edmonton Oilers, if you ask Sarah Sivian. That they are America's team. Nobody understood it when I said it yesterday. I picked the Oilers to go through to win it all, which is very daring. Mika went for the Kings, actually, so she did stay awake for overtime last night. She was up for that. She saw it, and she looked at me and was like, you sucker. So she totally has something, up her sleeve there. This is one of my favorite series of round one. It was one of my favorite series last year too, because the Kings had this like disruptor energy to them last year, and they're so much better than what they were last year. But so are the Oilers. I like how the Oilers address things. Like, they were wrong in the Jack Campbell signing. Anyone could see that coming, but they had Stuart Skinner, and they actually gave him the ice time so he could thrive. That's a big deal. Instead of saying, well, this is our $5 million goalie, we have to commit to him. They recognized he's not the one to go forward with. And I liked how they approached the deadline. Like Nick Bukestad, I think, was exactly what they needed. He's such a good third line center. He was great in Arizona against top competition. And you can kind of like suss out the noise of like playing on a bad team and actually try to extrapolate his value. And it seems like they did a good job. I know, Ken Holland's son, Brad Holland, has been working with some data there, and it seems like it's paying off if he was influential in the decision-making. And I have to think he was, based on the players that they chose. And Mattias Ekholm, too, like, that's another one that they picked. He's been really excellent so far. I think he's elevated Evan Bouchard's game. He was someone you wanted to see take a step forward this year, and he didn't initially. He didn't win the power play one quarterback job, and now it's his because Barry's gone, and he's thriving at 5-on-5 too. And we saw Ekholm really stand out last night. So it feels like this is the best Oilers team that there's been in a minute. Plus, you have Draisaitl, who's actually healthy on two legs and looked incredible last night. Such a difference maker. And, you know, I think it was in February, I wrote about him in the vibe check, and he was struggling a lot at 5-on-5. He couldn't carry his own line, which is why they kept putting him back with McDavid. And then you saw him completely flip switch, be one of the best players in March and, you know, now in April. So he got hot at the right time. And then you have McDavid doing otherworldly things. Like, this is the Oilers series to lose, but we can't count out the Kings. You know, we talk about the Oilers power play. What's going to happen if they don't get power plays, right? We all know that's, you know, a big deal for a lot of their scoring. I think everyone on top, the top unit, except for Bouchard, about 60% of their scoring comes off the power play. So if you don't get the calls, what happens? And if you run into a good penalty kill, what happens? And then for the Kings too, like, they made the most of their power play opportunities. And it's interesting because last night they went with Philip Deneau taking on the primary matchup to Connor McDavid. McDavid was the better player. He didn't do a good enough job of containing him. I don't expect that to continue, but it's, you know, a fact of the matter. Kopitar was up against Draisaitl. He did a little bit better of a job. I won't be surprised if we see that switch, especially once they get to home ice too, like when LA controls the matchups a little bit more. But even with the Oilers having home ice, like, the Kings still got the matchups I think they wanted. It just didn't work out as well. So we'll have to see like how that changes or doesn't as the series moves on. But the Kings have, you know, they still have that disruptor energy. They took game one. They took it in a heartbreaking way because that power play goal late with, you know, 17 seconds to go and then again in overtime, like, those are big swing moments. I can't see the Oilers just going down too far in the series. I'm sure they'll tie it back up and we'll have more narratives to talk about before game 3. But it really is an interesting series because both teams are so much better than last year. And it's not just the Kings. The Kings are a better team than when they started the season. They're a much better team than they were at the deadline too. And if they get Fiala back, that's something that's really dangerous. And Gabe Vigliardi too, like that's, you know, game changer material right there between the two of them. But the Oilers are so much better than they were at the deadline too. So I just keep looking at it going like, which most improved team can come out ahead? I still think it'll be Edmonton, but like, this is the upset that wouldn't surprise me. The two upsets I look at are the Islanders and the Kings, and I feel like the Kings I'm a little bit more confident in.
I hope I want the King, like the Kings' progress has been fun to watch, but there's also part of me just as a like hockey fan, like I don't want McDavid to lose in round 1 because I don't want the ensuing narratives that would come out of the about all of a sudden where we'd have to start where there would be the amount of columns ripping down the best player in the world. I just don't want that. For that reason, I want Edmonton to at least win round 1. We've gone through the playoffs and Shayna, thank you so much for this. I wanted to throw one thing to you, non-playoff wise, that Prashanth and I were asked when we announced this podcast at Wing Wheel Pod Day. And someone asked, when's the next year the Detroit Red Wings win a playoff series? Not get in, win a playoff series.
Okay, so I think next year they're going to be like legitimately in the race. I won't be surprised if they take a spot from, you know, we'll see what happens with the Capitals and we'll see what happens with the Panthers if, you know, another year, less money, things like that kind of bite them. And we'll see what happens with the Penguins who can turn it around quickly. I would say the next 2 years, they're going to be like the fringe playoff team, maybe get in. I think 3 years, they win a series. So not next year, not the following year, but the year after that. That's when that's too far. No. Not next year. The year after, I think they could win a series. They're going to be that little spoiler that like wins a series and then probably gets completely like killed in round 2. That's how I'm going to project it right now. I think that they have a good core and they have like a good start, but I just want to see them get like, I know they have up and coming forwards, but I want to see them bring in one difference maker up front, right? And you have Perron only for another year and then you're going to have to replace him anyway. He can be that internal replacement. I still think they need just like one high-end player on the back end would be ideal. Like Chikrin would have been a nice fit. But like up front, like if they can get one big difference maker, I think that they're a team to watch. And I really do like Ville Husso. So, you know, I think it could work out for them like in the near future. They could be a little disruptor in 2 years, let's say.
Well, people would be happy with that.
Am I too optimistic?
A little bit earlier than we had, I think, that both of us has on time-wise. But obviously the big thing on all of that with the Wings is May 8th is the earlier. And I'll go back to once again, Steve, if you're listening. Your birthday's May 9th. It's the day after the lottery. If you would love to come on and celebrate the lottery victory on Expected by Whom, we will save a spot for you. I've been pitching
Friend
Steve.
of the podcast, Steve.
Yes,
I know you're listening.
yes,
of course you're listening.
We know you're listening. We know you run Tankathon multiple times, which we will do ourselves soon in our final segment of the night. So, day, whatever. Time doesn't exist here. So.
Well, Shayna, we wanted to greatly thank you for taking the time to join us on the podcast today, for being our inaugural first guest. We want to thank Mika for the contributions as well. Terrific commentary and insight. But for folks who don't know Shayna Goldman, one, I don't know what you're doing, but two, for my money, the most, you're not going to get any more thorough coverage of the NHL at large than from Shayna. So you can find her work at The Athletic and really all over the place. So Shayna, thank you so much again for taking the time to join us.
Oh my God, thank you. And I apologize for the chaos of Mika. She will get better at this soon. We are working very hard on containing her during I need like a Philip Deneau to contain her, like the Kings are trying to do with Crosby. I'm sorry, McDavid. Oh my God, my brain. But yeah, like she definitely needs a little more defense right now. We'll get there. We will get there. So thank you for having me.
It'll happen. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
That was The Athletic's Shayna Goldman, as always, fantastic. One of my truly, most favorite people in the world. So greatly appreciate her taking the time to be our very first guest on Expected by Whom. And with that, we'd like to conclude today's show with a little bit of the Red Wings playoffs right now, being the draft lottery. And so, Sean, I think you've got a little Tankathon special set up for us here.
Yeah, I'll play Bill Daly here, and we'll obviously we'll hit I've got Tankathon open. I'm going to hit the Sim Lottery button here, and do you want me to like present it to you like NHL like Lotto style, where I read it backwards from? Was that the way to do this? Like,
I mean, do you have the cards and the logos and everything, and we have the commercial breaks all set up, or?
No cards and logos, but I can, this will be very bad. I can attempt to draw the logo of the winner really poorly on this piece of paper. I will do that. Okay. Ready? For if you're listening, if you're just listening in the pod feed and not on YouTube, you're about to miss out. So let's see. Okay. We have the 2023 draft lottery has been simulated. And I am going to start, as I am reading from 16 to 1, I'm going to start drawing the winner. And this is going to be terrible.
It'll really go to show how much people can multitask, right? So,
yes, we are. All right, with the 16th pick in the 2023 NHL draft, recently changed their GM, but for some reason are keeping their same coach, the Calgary Flames. The 15th pick, new GM again, actually, that seems to be a common theme here. Still same coach, Nashville Predators. Same thing with 14, the Pittsburgh Penguins. Number 13, the Buffalo Sabres. At 12, it is Ottawa won the pick, but it's an Ottawa pick that goes to Arizona. At 11, we have the Vancouver Canucks. At 10, we have the St. Louis Blues. And for this exercise, unfortunately, the Detroit Red Wings are picking at 9. No movement for the Detroit Red Wings. So everyone, this is where all the GMs and everyone gets quite upset and just starts saying, "Oh well."
I mean, honestly, in Detroit, no movement is still better than what's happened in the years prior, right? You know, they're not moving down. 9 is true. At least they stayed the same.
That's true. That's true. That's very true. At number 8, we have the Washington Capitals. At number 7, we have the Philadelphia Flyers. And so from 6 in, we've got some movement here. So it's we've got some movement from 6 in, and at number 6, the Montreal Canadiens have dropped one spot to 6. They would have been 5th. The Chicago Blackhawks have dropped to 5th. The Columbus Blue Jackets have dropped to 4. Oh, wow. The Anaheim Ducks are at 3, meaning our picks 1 and 2 are between two teams that are absolutely horrendous for me to draw. But so to flip the envelope with the first pick in the simulated NHL draft lottery as of April 18th, until we do it again next week, the 2023 first round NHL draft pick will go to the Arizona Coyotes.
Oh, I love the Kachina there. That's about as good as you can do.
Oh my God, yeah. I mean, the Sharks one was almost worse. Like, this is the worst possible thing. Like, there's some really bad
worst possible outcome for you to have.
Yeah, actually, I mean, a lot of the teams near the bottom of this are very like trying to draw Columbus or San Jose. Like it's gonna be difficult. It's gonna be difficult. The Detroit one will be a little bit easier. It's not a difficult logo to draw comparatively compared to some others. With this, and I'll screen grab this one just so proof of life to everyone. With this pick, we talked about kind of Detroit not moving back, and at 9, I still think they're going to get a pretty good player. I don't know it was funny, you and I were talking to a couple people at the Wayne Buell podcast event, and someone brought up Will Smith from the National Development Team, and I don't think Will Smith is going to be at this spot. You might be able to get a Ryan Leonard. You might get Jaden Perron, I think. That he might be in this realm. And then you're also kind of in the spot where this is the place where, by staying at 9, you're in a very interesting conversation about what happens with Matvei Michkov, because obviously Michkov is, who knows what's going to happen with Michkov long term. It feels very Kaprizov-esque, where whoever drafts him is going to have to wait 2-3 years at least. So, I mean, 9, you didn't move back, right? You ended up where you're supposed to be, but
look, if it ends up going this way, you didn't move back, and the top 3 picks, are all out west. So you're not adding any more talent into the East, right? You've
correct.
You've at least avoided Bedard, Fantilli, and potentially Leo Carlson going at 3, being in your same conference. So that's at least a huge plus for the Wings.
In this play, I mean, you have Columbus picking 4, which is actually the Columbus dropping all the way to 4 would be, for how bad their season was, would be quite a disappointment, actually.
Yes.
Now they, and you have Montreal picking ahead of you, and then you also, Philly and Washington are ahead of you too, but I really don't see much of the plan in Philly. I honestly believe in this draft, after the top 4. I mean, well, there's always tiers in a draft, right? Like this year, there's guy 1, there's guy 2, and then that you start to have the debate of how big is tier 3. It's obvious there's going to be there's Bedard, there's Fantilli, and then then you start debating how big tier 3 is, and you might even be in the spot where I really like Leo Carlsson, so I don't think you're getting the same player at 9 as a team is getting 3 at Leo Carlsson, but maybe some teams do believe that. So I don't know, but not the worst case scenario. We drew a Kachina. It's going to be Connor Bedard's got to go to Connor Bedard going to Arizona. If that doesn't help get the arena deal done, I don't know what will. And I don't like ripping on Arizona just because they've done a lot of things, but I don't like ripping on the hockey fans there because it is actually like they've grown a good, like there's good youth hockey. Like it's the like I and as someone who worked in Texas, and I'm sure as someone for you who lives in North Carolina, like you kind of, there's times where you don't want to see teams move from Sunbelt cities because you don't want it's the Sunbelt, hockey doesn't work. You don't want that narrative out there. And so I just hope that this would be the precursor of Arizona actually getting the building done in a reasonable time, because I don't want a top 3 player in the world playing on a college campus. So.
Yeah, and I mean, hey, if you're having Connor Bedard, Logan Cooley, Dylan Guenther, and that entire loaded prospect pool, that team is certainly going to be back. And, I'll echo your point there. For Wings fans who remember watching the Wings back in 2010, 2011, going up against the Coyotes in the Western Conference in the playoffs, that building was electric. Hockey it works there. They just got to win, and they have to get some competent management there, and they have to get some folks that know how to move the needle in the right direction. But when they have a competitive team like they did back in the early 2010s, that worked. They were electric. So yeah. With that being said, appreciate everybody tuning in to another episode of Expected by Whom. As always, if you have any feedback, please DM that directly to Ryan Hanna, and we'll catch you next time.